So the first one here that I have is Alex. She's a 30-year-old woman, not on oral contraception, not a professional athlete, but as you just said then, still an athlete. She trains 4 or 5 times a week, and her goal is to be strong, healthy, and quote-unquote toned. I pulled this from some of the questions that were submitted to me, which I guess means lean muscle without too much body fat. I think that's what she's going for. Let's say that Alex is a blank canvas. She's willing to just follow whatever nutrition advice you give her. Where would you start? What would you want her to consider with regards to her nutrition to complement that exercise that you just walked us through?
First, I want to instill the 80-20 rule. So 80% of the time we're spot on with the things that we want to do. And then 20% of the time, without guilt, is when we're having fun with life, where you might have wine, you might have chocolate, you might go out for indulgence. There's no such thing as a cheat meal, none of that stuff. Like, I want to remove all of those boundaries that get stuck in people's heads. Then the next thing would be really looking at, when is she training? Is she training first thing in the morning? Is she training in the evening? And how are we going to fuel for that? So if she's training in the gym, resistance training first thing in the morning, I want her to have around 15 grams of protein before she goes in, because that 15 grams of protein is going to feed forward to better EPOC and better adaptations after the resistance training. After her training session, she has breakfast. She has her real food. She has a real breakfast. And then we're looking at general doses of protein throughout the day. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean? Is she vegan? Is she not? So we're just trying to hit around that 30 grams at each meal, 15 grams at each snack. And then we look at no food after dinner, no nighttime snacks, right? We really want to make sure that your body can get into a parasympathetic drive for sleeping. We know that if you eat within 2 hours of going to bed, then there's a competition and you don't quite get into that parasympathetic response we want for good sleep architecture.
Okay, so no food a couple hours before bed, prioritizing protein throughout the day, and coming back to what you said earlier, no fasting. So it seems quite clear that what you're saying for Alex to optimize her physiology and get the most out of her time spent in training, that she shouldn't be doing so in a fasted state. Correct.
And if she's like, wait, I heard about intermittent fasting, it's like, well, we can look at it as that 12-hour window where you don't eat after dinner. Mm-hmm. And then you have breakfast, or you have your protein before you go to the gym, because then your body's going to get that time period where, I can't say the literature supports it because it doesn't support it in women, but from the buzzwords of media, where you're going to get to the advantages of fasting, but we just call it normal eating.
Right. And is it just protein that she should focus on prior to that training session? Would any athlete also think about carbohydrates? Okay, so it depends on the modality of the training.
Yeah. If it's going to be any kind of cardiovascular, we need 30 to 40 grams of carbohydrate with that protein. Women don't eat enough carbohydrates in general because there's this big fear of carbohydrate, and we need to have carbohydrate availability. One, because then that helps with hitting intensities and adaptation. 2, it feeds the brain, keeps the brain happy, going, hey, there's nutrition coming in. And that also feeds forward to helping keep out of low energy availability when we have a lot of carbohydrate availability.
How does Alex kind of keep track of her energy availability? You know, she could, I guess, count calories, but I mean, let's just say she's not wanting to count calories. How does she know if she's fueling herself enough for her training?
So if we look at the snack before training and having a real meal after, that is the biggest start, because then you're getting to the hypothalamus that we have nutrition to come in to support that stress. And then we want to make sure that she's eating carbohydrate and protein at every meal, right? When we start looking at adaptations to training, if she's not finding there's adaptations happening after about a month, if she's starting to put on a little bit of belly fat, then we know that she's eating enough. So then we revisit and go, okay, well, let's see what kind of carbohydrates you're eating. We know that you're on point with protein, but let's dial it in a little bit more.
Alex has come across a little bit of information on social media about low carbohydrate diets, maybe the ketogenic diet, and that perhaps helping her lean up. How do you feel about low carbohydrate diets for a woman? And perhaps we can split that and say a woman who is primarily doing strength training versus a woman who is doing primarily cardiovascular, high intensity type training.
I'm not a fan of low carbohydrate diets, just full stop. So again, when we're looking at the literature about low carb, high fat, ketogenic diets, the population is either obese postmenopausal women or male athletes or sedentary men. So when we look at the recreational female athlete or just female athlete in general, there is no data to support it. When we look at the literature about carbohydrate availability and how having adequate carbohydrates prevents illness and injury, helps improve adaptation, then we can make that kind of a priority. And we also know that in the luteal phase, where your body isn't so kind of releasing carbohydrate for training, you need to supply it. You need to have a higher amount of carbohydrate coming in the luteal phase in order to actually do the training that you want to do, regardless of if it's strength or if it's aerobic. So it's that baseline of carbohydrate. It's like carbohydrates are good. I'm not saying refined white bread. I'm saying, complex carbs, fruit, veg, grains. You can have your sourdough bread, don't be afraid of it because your body needs it and loves it and uses it.
So nutrition for Alex might change a little bit through the cycle. And what about total calories? Is there a period or a phase during the menstrual cycle where she may be eating more calories?
Yeah, again, in the luteal phase, because the goal of progesterone when it's released is to create a very lush endometrial lining. So you're building tissue, you're shuttling carbohydrate away from the liver and the muscle into the endometrium. Progesterone is responsible for breaking down lean mass to supply amino acids again to build the tissue. So this is why I said earlier, there's about a 12% increase in your protein needs, and you need to supply more carbohydrate if you want to hit any kind of intensities, but also for that competition between liver, muscle, and endometrium. We know that it's around 150 calories for 60 kilo woman. So it's not a lot of increase, but women are I can't eat anymore. I have this set amount that I can only eat. And again, we're not algorithms, and our baseline needs change across the menstrual cycle and also change according to what kind of training we're doing.
Which again kind of highlights the importance of understanding where your physiology is at a particular moment and doing the diary and sort of knowing where you are in your cycle at any point in time.
Yes.
What about particular nutrients or micronutrients, someone of Alex's age and sort of lifestyle and what she's trying to achieve, short, I guess, of like deficiencies and gaps and just plugging gaps in the diet? Are there any like particular nutrients that are especially important for her to consider either through specific foods or through supplementation?
Creatine, for one, and not high doses like the bodybuilding loading aspect. We know 3 to 5 grams total a day is really beneficial, not only for muscle performance, but also for brain health and cognition. Women have around 70% of the stores that men do, partially from actually being able to store it, but also because they tend to eat less foods that have creatine in it. So if we're looking at supplementation, it helps with mood, it helps with performance, it helps with recovery and repair. If she's someone that is on the borderline of anemia, has low iron, but falls in the normal range, so her doctor won't do anything about it, then we know that if we're supplementing with iron every other day, starting day 1 of the period leading up to ovulation, that improves iron absorption, because again, that works with the way hepcidin responses are. So hepcidin inhibits iron absorption, lowest during the follicular phase, and starts to come up because inflammatory responses after ovulation. So if you're trying to just get a little bit higher than the low end of normal, then we want to supplement every other day starting day 1 of the period. Those would be the 2 big ones that we like, okay, this is what we want you to do. We can also look at downgrading inflammation in the luteal phase by having more vitamin D, and of course, looking for more omega-3 fatty acids that helps with that inflammatory response. So ideally through food, but you can't really get the creatine and the iron that you want when you're looking at trying to go above and beyond what food can supply.
Is there an iron supplement or dose that you like? I appreciate it. It could be quite individual depending on someone's results.
Yeah, we look at carboxyl iron, and we try to have just like the baseline of the 40 milligrams of elemental iron from carboxyl iron. You can buy that over the counter. That's a standard dose that you can get in the chemist. And it's not that expensive, but it's highly bioavailable, and it doesn't cause all the side effects of constipation and gut rot and that kind of stuff you get with a lot of iron supplements.
Okay. And you mentioned creatine, and I guess as a kind of side note to that, could probably be even more important if someone's following a vegetarian style diet with less animal foods and has less creatine in their diet at baseline.
Yes.
And there is some research that speaks to that. What about other ergogenic supplements? So things like beta-alanine or caffeine. I guess, potentially you could even include protein powder in this bucket. How do you feel about these different supplements for a woman?
Protein powder, you use it because you can't eat enough or it's easy. So add that in your cadre of things to help support your nutrition. We look at caffeine. It's not really a sex difference thing. It becomes a responder thing. We know from a genetic aspect, you can have fast responders, slow responders, and then people who have an allele of both don't respond at all. So that becomes more of an individual thing. When we look at beta-alanine, we look at beet juice. There hasn't been any robust studies done on women. We know a little bit about nitrates from some work done in Canada looking at premenopausal women, where it doesn't really have an effect with regards to increasing VO2 capacity, aerobic capacity. But we do see effect in late peri, early postmenopausal women when they start to have less vessel compliance. So that's interesting. It's more of a life stage approach for supplementation. We look at beta-alanine. There is definitely efficacy for it, but there hasn't been any robust studies to use it. So we look at it as like an acute dose instead of a chronic loading effect. So if she's going in and she has a competition of sorts and she wants to be able to hit that PR, then boosting a little bit of beta-alanine is definitely going to help her.
Mm-hmm. And what about herbs or adaptogenics or, quote unquote superfood powders? You see these things marketed all the time. Is there anything within this sort of area that could help optimize Alex's hormone profile for best results?
I'm a fan of adaptogens, but specifically looking at what a person needs. So if Alex tends to have more estrogen dominance type responses. So she gets a lot of bloating, she has bad PMS, starts to have some skin breakouts, has a lot of mood changes. Then we're like, okay, well, we know that there's a misstep between your estrogen progesterone ratio. So I'm going to put you on DIM. And DIM is really not an adaptogen, but it's like eating 17 heads of cauliflower a day, which you wouldn't do. So if you're taking 200 milligrams of DIM, it helps with estrogen metabolism and stabilizes things. If she is someone who is tired but wired, so has that sympathetic drive, then we look at using ashwagandha or rhodiola to kind of work with cortisol to downgrade the sensitivity of the body to cortisol and help bring up that parasympathetic response. Again, it's individual, but there are really only 9 true adaptogens that have been robustly tested, peer-reviewed. You can get them off the NIH website under the Complementary Alternative Medicine, or you can go to the Mayo Clinic website, and it has like the professional scope, the layman's scope. So there is some efficacy for using things like maca for hormonal control, DIM definitely, rhodiola, ashwagandha, the contraindication for ashwagandha is if you have thyroid effects, because it can stimulate your thyroid. So just being aware of that. Then we look at the medicinal mushrooms. So we see reishi has a good effect if you're cycling it in and out. It helps with stress and parasympathetic response. Cordyceps, there's not a lot of efficacy for women with regards to sports performance, but it is beneficial for downgrading stress. So again, it works like ashwagandha. So those would be the ones that would be more independent, but there is good efficacy to use it within women.